Okay, so just to say what I said before I started recording, we're going to be going through the movie search CLI benchmark module today. I'm just going to live code our way through it. The specs are here in the curriculum. We're going to use HTTP from the built-in HTTP library in Node and a Cheerio library to parse HTML. And we have this URL here that will allow us to search the Imdb website. I'm just going to paste that in here from the module to see what that looks like. So we've got this little URL, and there's this part here. So we've got our URL /find question mark. So this is the query, and it's got 3 different arguments: ref _, q equals, s equals. And this is kind of provided for us, that this q part is the search term. So we should be able to just type anything in that piece of the URL and get a different set of results. So what we want to do is we want to write a command line application that hits this URL and then parses this page to pull out the movie titles and just prints them in our terminal so that we can search for movie titles without even having to use our browser, which is what we all want to do on our days off. So let's get started. Let me flip over to specs again. So I've got a blank directory here called movie search. And just to be thorough, I'm going to npm init this thing and just take all of the, oh, can't contain capital letters. That's silly. There we go. Take mostly the defaults here. And yes, that's okay. So now I have a package.json file. And it says my main is going to be index.js, so I'll just use that, index.js. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is figure out how do we download a web page in Node. And the specs here are helpful in that they point us to Node's HTTP module. So I've got the documentation for that open in this tab here. This is just the nodejs.org site. It's kind of what comes up if you type node HTTP. And there's this super helpful looking method here called HTTP get, which will issue a GET request to a URL and hand us some data back. And it looks like it takes some options and then a callback, and says that the options accepts the same options as HTTP request. So we're going to click and see what that is. And it looks like there's a bunch of these, but the important looking things are host and path. Now let's see if there's an example down here. Yeah, so here's an example, like host name and a port and a path and a method. Headers if we want. So let's give that a shot and see what we can get working. So we'll start out with a function called query Imdb, maybe, that takes some sort of search argument. And we're going to need, the HTTP object, which we can just require HTTP. You don't have to npm install anything because it's built into Node. And then we can do this HTTP get, pass it some options. We're just going to do an inline object here. And we're going to have options that include, host. So we just need to pull the host part of this URL out, right? Which is just imdb.com. Stick that in there. Just the host. And then the path, right, is just everything after and including the slash. So there we go. We'll grab that. And then a callback. And the callback, if we look at this documentation here, So this callback gets a res argument, which is short for response. And that response, it'll probably tell us up here, options, and note that the response data must be consumed for the reason stated in client request. Incoming message. The callback is invoked with a single argument that is an instance of incoming message. And it looks like if we just look at this examples, we can pull out headers from that. And we can also, it looks like, declare new callbacks for what to do when data is received from that incoming message and when we're done getting data. So let's see what that would look like in our case. We're going to create this little callback here. I'm just going to do it inline for right now. And the way this works, because JavaScript is asynchronous, this callback gets called as soon as we've started the request to the server, but before necessarily all of the data has been returned from the server. So at the time that this thing gets called, the server may still be sending us data. And every time we get a little bit more data from the server, this data event will fire. So we can register a handler for that by using this on method from the, what did they call it? Incoming message that we got back. So we can say, okay, when this incoming message, when we get more data, we want to do something with it. And we're just going to follow their lead from this example and say, okay, we're going to get a chunk of data. And then we are going to add it to something. So let's create a var to hold our HTML from the page. And we'll initialize it to an empty string. And then every time we get more data from the server, we can just say HTML plus equals chunk. So that's going to just append this chunk of data onto that HTML. So these chunks that are coming back are just strings. They're a string that's like the next bit of data that the server sent back. And so as we get data from the server and this event gets triggered, we're just kind of appending all of the data from the server into this one big string, which ultimately will hold all of the HTML for the page. So then we want to do something when we're done receiving data. So we can use this. Oh, somebody caught my spelling mistake. Thanks, Phil. Chunk. Better? Okay, so we're going to have another little handler here to handle the end event, which is just we're done receiving data. And at that point, put some question marks there. What are we going to do at that point? So we've got this method. It's got query Imdb. So let's do this. For now, just as a proof of concept, let's just log HTML and see what we've got at that point. So right now we've got a function that theoretically, if we did this right, it's going to hit this Imdb server. It's going to request this path as a HTTP GET request. And then we're going to read all the data back from the server. And once we have all the data, we're just going to print out the HTML right to the console. So I have this function. And for the simplicity of testing, I'm just going to call this function right here in this file. And we're going to search for Nemo. We will be finding Nemo. All right. And then I'm just going to open up a terminal here, and I'm gonna move into this movie search folder. There's my file, and so we should be able to say node index.js and see how bad it is. Hey, we just got a bunch of HTML. I'm gonna full screen that. Scroll back up. This looks kind of like the HTML for a web page. So it looks like that worked. Yeah, there's a little div in here. This is an Amazon company. Theoretically, that's going to live over here somewhere, right? Amazon. There it is, an Amazon company. So we're looking at the HTML for this page. Fantastic. So that raw HTML output is kind of useless if you're looking for the titles of the movies, but it's a start. All right. Any questions about that so far? Are we roughly following what we're doing, where we're at?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
With regards to the path, it's Rocky. Is that what you want to do on purpose, or is it going to be dynamic so that it actually searches for everything else, not just
Yeah, it's definitely we're going to need to make it dynamic. That's right. So right now we just have a script that always searches for Rocky. Yeah, so I passed in Nemo here. That's a good call. I passed in Nemo, but like we're not actually doing anything with that search term. Let's fix that. So we want to replace Rocky here with our search term. So I'm going to change this to the little backtick quotes and change Rocky to be whatever our search term is. Here we go. And let's see if that works. Didn't break. And let's see. If I search back up for Rocky, we should see Rocky in the HTML somewhere. Yep. It's on this page in a couple of places, so it looks like we're getting the right thing. It's in there a bunch of places. Great catch. Any other questions? Or bugs in my code that someone else has found? All right. So we got this giant chunk of HTML, and so now we need to like parse it somehow and just pull out. What we want to do is just pull out like these strings here, just like Rocky 1976, Rocky 1981. So to do that, we're going to use Cheerio because that's what the spec told us to use. So I'm going to close this thing for now just to make a little more room. And let's go out to our terminal and we'll just npm install Cheerio. And I'm going to say save dev so that it'll add it to our package file and like the development. No, not save dev, just save. So it'll add it to our package file. There we go. So it's installed. And it's in our package file now as a dependency. And if I go back to the code here, we can require it. So let's Cheerio. And I've got the docs open over here in another window. And so the way Cheerio works is, if you've ever played with jQuery, this is sort of providing a very similar API to jQuery. It's just giving it to you outside of a browser, just like server-side or in a script like this. So the first thing it looks like we got to do is load the HTML. So like given a string of HTML, we sort of load it and we get this variable back. And then we can kind of do searches and use CSS selectors to like pull certain chunks of that HTML out. So let's see what that would look like. So we've got this HTML. I think it's time to refactor a little bit here. Let's, for this end method, once we get the HTML, let's just call a new method called parse HTML. And let's write that function down here, parse HTML. It's going to get the HTML. And then we'll use Cheerio in here to do the parsing. So in their example, they're using this $sign variable, probably because that's the like jQuery convention, and that's sort of the API that they're mimicking. And I'm gonna roll with that so that our code looks like the examples and it'll be easier to track. And let's see, so right I'm going to Cheerio load the HTML, and that'll give us this sort of object back that we can do selections and stuff on. And then, oh, another typo. Parse HTML. Yeah, I misspelled it in both places. That's fantastic. There you go. Thank you. That's what's so great about pair programming. All right, so parse HTML, we're going to grab this thing. And then what we can do is we can use CSS selectors to pull out the parts of the HTML we want. So let's go look at this IMDb site. Is this too small? Can you all see that? No, I'm using kind of a big monitor. See if I can make this bigger. Well, there we go. Is that text big enough for y'all to see okay? Like a +1 in the, okay, great. Okay, so we're looking for this thing here. So let me do an inspect and let's see what this looks like. So the actual thing we're looking at is inside this anchor tag in this table data that has a class of result text. And it looks like the whole list is in this table, and there's like a row for each result, but all the results have this like result text table data. So that looks like an easy thing to search for. Let's look for that in the HTML. So just like CSS, right? Dot class name should sort of be a selector for all of those things. And then what we want to do is we want to take each of those elements and just get like the text within those elements. We want to filter out all the HTML and just get the text. So first we're going to map. So map this is a method that Cheerio provides to map through the elements that match a selection, just like you'd be mapping through an array. And this map is gonna give us two parameters, the index of the thing we're at, and then the actual element that we're looking at. And so we are gonna do that. Put this down here. And this is a little bit of a tricky thing. So once we get this element that we get back is actually a DOM element. It's just like the raw element from the document object model. It's not sort of a Cheerio enhanced element that's going to have all of the like helper methods that Cheerio objects have, or that like a jQuery object would have. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this $sign as a function just to wrap that element, and that allows us to call methods on it like text to get the text back. It's a little quirky element of the way this API works, but this is kind of mimicking the jQuery API, which has been around for a long time and is super popular. And that's just how it works in jQuery. You get the raw DOM element and then just wrap it in this $parenthesis method. And it sort of like mixes in all of this magic that lets you do things like just grab the text. And then the final thing we're going to need to do is I have to call one more method on this, which is toArray. Because what this $sign and this map is doing, it's returning this sort of like Cheerio object that represents a subset of your HTML. And if you want to actually get back just like a JavaScript object that has a list of things, you have to call toArray to sort of do that conversion. So if we stick all this in, we'll call it movie names. And then let's log it and see where we are. See if any of that worked at all. All right, and I've removed the other logging statement. So if this works, then we should see like just movie names printed out. And instead of flipping over to another terminal, I'm just going to use this : feature in VI, which will just send this command to the terminal and show us what the output would be without actually having to leave the editor. Should just save this a little time. So now, hey, there we go. So now we've got an array of movie names about fish that get lost. And if we actually run this command here, let's see, Nemo, why I'm only getting 2? Oh, I bet I have the wrong URL in here. So I typed it into the box. Movie, no, that looks right. Nemo. Interesting, I'm only getting 2 results here. But in our thing, we're getting lots of results. We're getting, oh, I see. Now we're getting all the things. We're getting the characters and we're getting the names. Okay, so our selector is a little too broad because we're pulling in like keywords like Captain Nemo and Little Nemo, companies. So we really just want the titles. So we need to get a little more specific in our selection. So we just find the relevant titles. So let's see. This thing here, it's the table and find header, find subheader, find section. So this isn't a find section, and there's that find section header. So we really just want the stuff from the first section. And this is going to test my memory for CSS selectors. So we want, we want the first find section on the page, which is going to be something like find section. Just saw this question in the chat. Sorry, Helen. How did you know to take in 2 arguments? Or better question, what is the I for if it's not getting used? Ah, great question. So, so I knew to take in 2 arguments because I've used this method before. So I kind of cheated and went from memory. But if we look up the documentation for map here, it shows us that it takes a callback function that's going to get past 2 elements, the index and the element itself. So that first I is just the, it's going to be like 0, 1, 2. It's just going to be the number of like the index of the thing that we're looping through. And we don't need it, but it's the first argument. So we have to like declare it there so that we can get to the second one. Does that make sense? Okay. So we want the result text from the first find section, and I'm going to look up. Because I know there's a way to do this, and I'm not forgetting what it is. Good old Microsoft Developers Network. If anybody knows, feel free to shout this out. But I'm pretty sure I can say, I want like the first sibling or something of that nature. Adjacent siblings, pseudo classes. All right, I'm gonna have to increase my Google clue. CSS selector for first element with class. First of type, first occurrence an element in container, Stack Overflow. Yay. This is well-known examples authors sending out first child works. The very first child of its parent. Well, that's not exactly what we want. First of type, which represents the first element among siblings of its element type. Okay, so let's look at this here and see if this thing that we're looking for, this titles, it lives in a find section. Okay, so we're just gonna have to get a little clever. So what we can do is, if we grab find section, we can do this in 2 steps. We can get all the things matching find section and then grab the first one, probably using Cheerio. Let's see if there is a next closest parent first. Yay. Awesome. So we can say find section and just grab the first one this way. And then within there, we can filter and then do our result. What was it? Result underscore text. All right, let's see. Let's see if that's any better. Oh, not even close. All right, I'm gonna comment some stuff out and do this a step at a time. So if we just look for first section, we get something, we get the tab, we get the find section. So that worked. And then, oh, filter, maybe I'm using the wrong method there. Filter says, iterates over a Cheerio object, reducing the set of selector elements to those that match the selector. That's not quite, I think we want find. Is there a find? There we go. Get the descendants of each element in the current set of matched elements filtered by a selector. That's what we want. So it is find instead of filter. Hey, there we go. So now we've got just the 2 things that we're looking for. Just the movies. Awesome. Peachy. So we're almost all the way home. We've got a thing that takes a search term and prints out the movies. It's not printing them out particularly nicely. So let's do that. We're going to get these movie names. Let's just return the movie names from Parse Html. And maybe let's rename that method to like get movie names. Right? Since that's really what it's doing now. And once we get them, why don't we make this query? Since this thing is just supposed to query, let's add a callback here. And pass the result back to the callback. In fact, let's do it this way. Movie names. Okay. And then down here, we can just say movie names. And then we'll just console log the movie names, and it's an array of the names. So let's just join those elements to the array with a new line, so they'll each print on a separate line. And our callback, it's a node style callback, so it's always going to get an error as the first argument if there is one, and then the movie names. And we can just say if we got an error, throw that error. So that'll just end everything with a error message if we get an error. Okay. There we go. So now they're printing out 1 per line, kind of like it shows in the spec. Fantastic. All right. So the next thing we got to do, we still have this hard-coded Nemo in our script, right? Like it always searches for Nemo. We need to solve that problem. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff to this point, though, before I move on? I've been talking for a while. We good?
Just towards the end, do you mind just going over the last steps there, or just added a little bit of stuff everywhere?
Yeah, what lines are you referring to?
Like line 12, from 13. Well, actually 12 is fine, but yeah, what did you do there for 13 when you added the second argument to?
Yeah, lines still up here on lines 12 and 13, this stuff here?
Yeah, just 13 CB. What is that for?
Okay, so CB is, it's an abbreviation for callback. So I added a callback argument to the query Imdb function, right? Because this function, we're hitting a database, it's happening asynchronously. So the query Imdb function is going to accept, I added a second argument to accept a callback so that we have a way to return results of our query, right? We want to be able to return those movie names from this function, and we can't just return them since it's happening asynchronously, so we're going to pass them to a callback. So this CB is just the callback function. And so once I get the movie names, when this end event fires, right, we'll use our little parsing method to get the movie names from the HTML, and then I'm going to invoke that callback with movie names as the second argument. And this callback, that's what I'm looking for, pattern. This callback pattern is like a Node style callback. So there's a convention in Node and in the Node community, I guess, for callbacks always to take the error, like an error first, and then the results second in terms of arguments. So your callback is always going to look, like this, right? When you write a callback function, it's going to have two parameters. The first one is going to be an error if there was an error, and the second one will be the actual result. So this is a really common pattern here where you're like error, whatever the thing is you're looking for, and then you just check to see if the error is present. And if the error is not null, then you got to do something about it. Otherwise, you move on. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And then just the null. Why did you have null as the first argument? Is that
right. So null, just because there's no error in this case. So that's the error argument. I'm just setting the error to null because there is no error. That make sense?
Is that a thing that Node does? Like, if you put something else there, even if you named it something else, it would still be the error argument?
So this is a convention that Node uses in a lot of places. So I'm sort of copying that convention. Node isn't going to do this for me. Like, this is a callback function that I'm writing, that I'm implementing. So we could do this the other way. I could just take out this error element altogether.
Like in that one down in line 28, how does it know that that's supposed to stand for the error?
It doesn't. It doesn't.
Okay.
I could just as easily call this thing like Steve. It's just an argument, just like any other argument. It's just that, like, by convention, callback methods are usually written so that they take an error argument first and then the results. So there's a lot of like built-in Node methods. So like this HTTP is a good example of like a built-in Node library. There's a lot of them you can see here, and a lot of these that if they have callbacks, the callback is usually invoked with an error argument as the first argument, and then like the result of whatever the computation was the second.
In the current example with Steve, does Steve need to still be programmed still? Like, or like, what would happen right now if there was an error? Right.
So this is the interesting part. We're not actually handling errors from this HTTP GET method. So maybe this would make more sense if we actually got to that point. So if there was like an error contacting Imdb, right? So if this site, we just changed the URL to be something that doesn't exist. If we run this now, that GET method will get an error and we get this unhandled error event, right? Because like deep in the bowels of Node, this error happened when it couldn't contact Imdb with a bunch of C's in front of it. And it's just not being handled anywhere. And so the program just crashes, right? But what we can do is we can add, so this HTTP GET method returns, where does it say this? It returns a client request. So if we capture that and call it request, so we have this object that represents the request, then we can do error handling on it. And we can say, okay, on this request, on error, so when there's an error, I want you to do this thing, right? And this takes a callback that is going to be called with an error, whatever the error was. And so what we can do is pass that error to our callback. Or we could simplify this by just passing the function in directly, right? Does that make sense that those two things are equivalent? Sorry, try this. So this second line, line 18, is just a simplification of line 17. Instead of like creating an anonymous function that takes an argument and then just calls another function with that same argument, I can just pass the callback in directly on line 18. Does that make sense? Okay, so if we do this, now we actually have some error handling. And so what'll happen, this crystal will start, we'll try and hit this host that doesn't exist, and we'll get an error. So on data will never happen, on end will never happen. Like we won't get to these events will never fire because there's an error connecting to the server to begin with. And so the callback will get called down here. And instead of being passed null and some movie names, it'll be passed an error as the first argument. So Steve down here will end up having an error in it. And just to make this more interesting, right? Let's make this if block. So then we can say, you know, which allows us to handle the error more interesting, like, so now if we run this, we should see something prettier than that giant, well, can I read property join? Ah, okay, so two things are happening. We're getting our message, but then we're getting an error further down. And that's because we've handled this error, but then we're not stopping before we get to this thing down here. So what we would want to do is just return. Because if we've gotten an error, we don't want to continue doing the other stuff we were doing. So now if we run this, we should just get our error message, right? There we go. Yeah. So does that make a little bit more sense then, how the error handling is happening now? So we just, by convention, we're saying query IMDb takes this callback function, and the sort of promise that this query IMDb function is making is if you call me and you hand me a callback function as a second argument, I will call that function, and if there's an error, I will hand you that error in the first argument. And if there's not an error, I will hand you like the results in the second argument. And so to make this code a little more self-documenting, we can rename that to error. But does that kind of make sense? Does that answer the questions you had? If not, say so, it's okay. I know this is kind of confusing. All right. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to change this return back to throw error, just to simplify this. So throw will just like, you know, cut short the execution of this method. So we'll never get to line 31 if there's an error, which is kind of what we want to do. All right, so let's see. Where are we? All right, so the thing we have not done yet is we still can't call this from the command line and choose what movies to search for. We are always searching for Nemo. So we need a way to pass arguments into this function. So if you've done one of the prior like CLI examples, you've probably dealt with this before. But there is a built-in global called process.arg. Let's do this. So built-in global called process.argv. And so process holds a bunch of attributes that have to do with like the currently running process. You could get the current process PID, just like is shown from the PS output. You could get that like the ID of the running process and a bunch of other stuff, your current working directory, those types of things. You can also get any arguments that were passed on the command line when this process was started. So we could log this here. So when we invoke this thing with, I'm going to split this out just to be clear. Let's get back into that directory. Okay, so when we invoke node index.js, and we run this, we get another error because I can't type today, apparently. Oh, right. An error because this is still bogus. There we go. Let's try that again. There we go. So the first thing that's printing out here is process.argv. And what's showing us is the command that was executed to run this program. So we typed node index.js, and the shell, ZSH in this case, or bash, or whatever you use, kind of takes that command and does some interpreting and say, okay, you said node, and it searches through its path variable to figure out, okay, which node application are you referring to? And it finds it in my file system. And it's okay, index.js, what index.js file are you referring to here? And it sort of finds it in the current directory. And so it translates those into these like absolute paths instead of the relative paths that we're using here, right? But it's just the first two components of the command that we run. And what you'll see is that if we type stuff, more things on the command line, 7, they all get shoved into that argument vector, that argv array. It just gets passed on into the program. It's being ignored, but it's being sort of saved there. So what we can do is we can use that functionality to search for other things like cars, right? And so now we'll get cars there. It's the third element of the argv array. So if we want to pass in the search term from the command line, it should be as simple as, let's do this and say const search equals process.argv index number 2, which is the third element, right? And so that should allow us to search for cars. Hey, there we go. And now we can just search for whatever we want, Rocky. And if we're just doing one word, we don't really need quotes around that. Request path contains unescaped characters. Oh, it does not like spaces. That's a problem we can fix later. Right, so that actually gets us a good bit of the way home, right? We have a command line application, and you can pass in the name of things, and it will search for movies using IMDb. I'm going to, since we just have 10 minutes left, instead of going on to like how you would write tests for this, which is an interesting challenge in and of itself, and maybe something we can talk about in office hours tomorrow or like in a subsequent lecture, or just hit me up afterwards if you got time. But instead of doing that, I'm going to clean this up a little bit because this is kind of ugly that we have this like library file, but then there's just like code that gets run every time this file gets evaluated. It's a little messy. So what I would probably do here is create a run method and move this stuff. Move this stuff inside it, right? And then call the run method down here. And what I like to do is say if not module parent. Okay. And that'll just set us up nicely for when we start writing tests. So now all the code I have is like wrapped inside of functions here, which kind of keeps it clean, keeps it in its own namespace. And then this if not module parent, this is a pattern that you'll see in different libraries where you have a file that like contains some functions that you may want to export into tests to invoke from other places, but also has some like default functionality that like there is like a script to be run here. And module.parent just points to the file that required this file. So if you're requiring this file as part of a test suite to like test these functions, module.parent will be populated. So this condition, not module.parent, will be false, and we just won't actually like run this query. But when we execute this thing from the command line, there is no module parent, and so it will run that thing by default. Quest path contains unescaped characters. Oh, I keep doing that. There we go. And that works. So let's see, where are we? So yeah, still left to do here would be create the Mocha and Chai, create tests using Mocha and Chai. And as you can see, we've got a little bug in here that if we try and search for something that has spaces in it, we get this error about unescaped characters in the path. So that's a problem that we would have to solve. But for now, we got something that works if you search for one word or if you smush all your words together.
Is it possible that where you can actually just filter out the space?
How's that?
Filter out the space between Finding Nemo.
Yeah, you could filter it out, or you could also escape it. So there's a URL. There's a protocol for URLs to escape characters that aren't valid in a URL. So a space is not a valid character to have in a URL. So if you want to put one in a query string, it gets escaped. So you'll see if we, Nemo, Finding Nemo, if we actually search for something with a space here just in their site, you see they're just putting a plus sign there instead of the space, which is one way to escape a space. So we could filter them out, or we could just go through and like replace them with plus signs, which would work. Won't bother going into that right now, I guess. Any other questions about any of this? Or anything else?
One last small thing, and also maybe is it possible to filter out the quotes as well, so that the user doesn't have to worry about putting Finding Nemo in string?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So if we go back to logging out argv, the reason we do the quotes is actually because of the way that the shell interprets commands. So without the quotes, if I say finding space Nemo, the shell is using the spaces to break up the command into its different parts. So finding becomes the third argument and Nemo becomes the fourth argument. So the quotes are a way to sort of tell the shell, hey, this thing is one argument. It's not the third and fourth argument. It's like just the third. But there would be a way around that, which is just grab all of the arguments from like index 2 onward. So you can use slice for that. So you can say slice 2 and then just don't put an endpoint on it. And now search will contain just everything you typed in. And then we could join that array and we could join it with that plus sign, right? which is the way that they're escaping spaces in the URL. So if we did that, I've not tried this before. Let's give it a shot. Yay, it works. Finding Nemo. Yeah. And there are like libraries for doing like more complicated command line argument parsing. So we're sort of like directly manipulating process.argv, which is the thing to do in this case because we have a really simple case. But if you wanted to start adding like, oh, well, I want to have like flags for my command, you know, that like maybe one flag tells it no, search Google instead of IMDb, or, you know, you want some kind of verbose output or something like that. There are libraries that will like kind of do some of the process.argv parsing for you and allow you to have like more complex command line interfaces for your apps. But for something like this where you just want like, you know, all the things smushed together, rolling it yourself is easy enough. Got a few more minutes. Any other questions?
What happens? Oh, does the session end exactly at 11? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's on the calendar. I don't think I have. I've got a meeting in about 30 minutes. So I've got a little extra time. If y'all have more questions, we can hang around. But,
one last thing as well. If you go back to the original screen where you had the function, just for where on line 20 through 23, where result underscore text, is that a specific way to extract the content from the HTML page?
Yeah, so result text is actually, remember we looked in the HTML, and result text is just the class that IMDb has placed on the element that holds the title of the movie. So each of these like titles is in a TD, and all of those TDs have that result text class. So that dot result text is just a CSS selector to like pull out those specific elements from the DOM.
Oh, so it's pulling all those elements out, not just that one specific.
Right, yeah. So it's just like in a CSS file, you know, if you wanted to like color all these things a certain way, you know, you could say dot result text, you know, color red or whatever, and it would like match. It just matches everything on the page that matches that selector. And so this like Cheerio API works the same way, where it just lets you use a CSS selector, and then it'll like find sort of returns an object that represents the collection of everything on the page that matched your selector.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you all for showing up. And we're doing one of these, I'm trying to remember, one of these lectures a week, maybe two of these lectures a week. No, so for phase 2, we do a lecture on Wednesday, and I'll do some live coding, live code review on Fridays. But if there's other things that you want to see in a lecture, doesn't have to be a walkthrough. If you want me to just like talk about something, go into detail, I'm open to suggestions. But yeah, definitely use this resource. And yeah, I'll see you all around. Thanks so much.
Thank you.